Good afternoon. I'm Alan Weil, Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. We're a leading health policy journal based in the United States and have had a relationship with the WISH program since the first meeting some years ago. I'm pleased today to be able to moderate a session on global health policy supporting innovation. We are a policy journal, so we focus on the policy context. What does it take to support the kinds of innovations, many of which you've been hearing about at the meeting thus far? In fact, I want to assure you, if you've seen these three presenters before at the data science and artificial intelligence session, we're going to have a different conversation here than the one yesterday, a somewhat more intimate session, but also one focused on the policy issues that are relevant to innovation. And when we talk about innovation, of course, it's a very broad term. We'll be covering the ability to move forward on both the science of healthcare as well as the organization that supports innovation in healthcare. And to join me in the conversation, we have Effie Vaina, Professor of Bioethics in the Department of Health Sciences and Technology at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. We have Aziz Sheikh, Professor of Primary Care Research and Development in the Center for Population Health at the University of Edinburgh in Great Britain, and David Bates, Chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. We've published work from all of these distinguished scholars here in our journal, and so what we're going to do with the hour that we have is I'm going to ask two of them to give a very quick overview of the papers that they published in our journal, and then we'll move into a discussion of the most important factors to create an environment that is supportive of innovation. So David and Aziz were two of the three authors on a piece that we published in March of last year on innovative environments in healthcare, where and how new approaches to care are succeeding. And maybe just to get us started, David, if you could give us a high-level overview of what was in that paper.
Sure. I'm David Bates. We talked in that paper about what the key ingredients were for academic innovation centers in particular, and made the case that things that were particularly important were having patients involved in developing things, enabling access to providers, making sure that organizations got clinical availability. They had a lot of trouble actually accessing clinical systems. And then there are some things that could be done on the innovation center side to make things work more smoothly, like having open APIs and putting in place tools that enable you to get at those APIs.
Great. And Effie, you wrote a piece for us, a very interesting analysis of how different organizations approach the topics of data sharing. And so, again, your piece, which was published in May of this year, if you could just give us a quick overview.
Thank you. So what we wanted to do was to look at how organizations, what kind of guidelines organizations have published around data sharing. And we looked, initially we thought, well, there are about 50 or so out there. So that's going to be an easy thing to do quickly. It turns out that when we went more systematically, we identified 230 guidelines eligible for our review, being published from 1996 to 2017. So 20 years of guideline development on data sharing, and yet we didn't have all that sharing that we wished to have. So we looked at those, did different methods of analysis, and what we found was that all these organizations concentrated on three policy themes, which was privacy, autonomy, meaning getting people's consent for data uses, and quality of data. And a lot of other important themes, they were getting systematically a lot less attention. And the other thing we found was that there was a what we called a fragmented kind of policy landscape in terms of both how the organizations were connected with each other, but also how they fragmented the policy themes by focusing just on three of those and not very, very little on the rest of the other very important ones.
So for those who maybe didn't go to your session yesterday, why don't you give us a thumbnail on why it's so important to have data sharing if we're going to achieve the potential in innovation around, for example, precision medicine and other diagnostic advances?
Well, I think partly because our understanding, we have a convergence of various trends, and one is our increasing understanding from the kind of biological and molecular kind of level, and we have a lot of developments in the data analytics side. So we are hoping, and we think we're able to harness the potential of a lot of data to understand better basic mechanisms of disease and health. And so it seems that if we were able to get access, if we were able to link, combine, and analyze different sources of data, not just one kind of data, we could get a more comprehensive picture of what disease is or what health, and then, of course, from those to develop different kinds of therapeutic approaches or better prevention. So for precision medicine, at least, as we have been defining, it seems that it is a crucial element to have ways to ways to generate and analyze these kinds of different sources.
And you mentioned the,
That's one.
one more question.
Okay, good,
Yes,
good.
I'll follow up a little so that
Yeah.
we can have a good platform to discuss. You mentioned the leading topics, privacy, autonomy, data quality. Those all make sense. They're very important. But when we have conversations about combining data, other topics come up, particularly around things like integrity and interoperability, solidarity, the ability to bring these together. And in your analysis, topics like the common good or solidarity show up very rarely. So we can emphasize the sort of the positive elements, that we need to have high quality data, we need to honor privacy. But it seems like the potential of big data rests also on advancing some of these topics that didn't get so much attention. So can you say a little bit more about the ones that sort of fell low on the list of?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we're quite surprised to see that, because when we did our analysis, it was just so clear that the three of those, privacy, autonomy, and data quality, they were the favorites. And solidarity that you mentioned was very rarely mentioned. And you'd think that if we were going to kind of pursue this, that's one of the messages we have to keep sending. So certainly that's the picture. What surprised us a little bit more is that there was little on accountability. Now, when we talk about big data, not just in health, but in general, accountability is one of the most important things we should be thinking about, because that is something that could support the trustworthiness of systems, so people and organizations can trust each other, and therefore, out of that goodwill and leap of faith, maybe, start sharing or engaging in these kinds of collaborations. So there was little on accountability, and I think that's one, for example, we could do a lot more about and encourage policymakers to support that. It will have trickle-down effects if we did that. The solidarity you mentioned as well, it was another one that got a very little attention. Attribution was another one that we didn't see being talked about. For example, one of the problems we've been seeing is if people collect data and they put a lot of effort to do that, effort to curate data, then somebody comes and wants to use this data and run with it. And it's a great thing to do that, and it will have a good outcome, maybe a good paper and a good product, but those people who generated the data need to get some credit as well. We talked about this in some settings, but again, there's little that's been going on in there. And you could call that sort of attribution not just an incentive, but also the fair thing to do. And so these kinds of issues that they are not rocket science type of approach, right? They're corresponding to basics of human behavior. They can be fairly I'd say, simple things to do, we've seen very little attention on those. So, and one of the recommendations we made was, it's not, that doesn't mean that privacy, autonomy, and data quality are not important. They're, of course, absolutely important. But we need to recalibrate those a little bit and start talking more about all these others, and it's a long list of those, that hopefully will maybe bring us closer to our goal of sharing.
So before I let you go, one last item. Also very low on the list was sustainability. And when we think about the investment needed to bring data sets to use, the notion that you don't have a plan or a policy around sustaining the investment seems surprising. So one more thought on that, and then we'll...
Yeah, that was another surprise, and shows a little bit the kind of short-term thinking that we see in a lot of those initiatives. Sometimes you generate a fantastic data set, or you even have a data sharing approach. It just lasts for the duration of the collaboration, and then it's gone. And that, of course, has not been conducive to to more sharing. So I think that is very important. Again, I'm a believer of simple steps here. I think it is not incredibly difficult to implement certain steps that can help us sustain this kind of, let's say, sharing, but requires some more long-term thinking and conditions to be put in place early on. So that would be, again, I believe, one of those who would help us with our goal.
Great. Aziz, the paper you and David wrote for us was looking at organizational investment in innovation. So why don't, if you could, just talk a little bit about what it is that organizations need to have in place to create an environment that's supportive of innovation.
Yeah, so maybe, Alan, just before trying to answer that question, let me try and pick up on a couple of themes to do with data sharing, because I think there are a couple of other really important drivers here. For those of us who do evidence synthesis pieces of work, and increasingly for policy purposes, these are incredibly important. I mean, if there was a more liberal data sharing, that task would be made so much more efficient. So I mean, I think that's one driver, and the other driver that's particularly exercising opinion leaders in the UK, for example, is this issue of the reproducibility of science. So lots of concerns have been raised, and we, I think, need to get into a position where we are actively facilitating that reproducibility agenda. And I think data sharing, I mean, that can be a step in that process. It isn't often enough, because what you need to be doing is sharing the code as well, for example, and we're beginning now to try and institutionalize that. So coming back to your question, so in the piece that David and I were involved in, we were looking at this a bit from a transatlantic perspective, and one of the things that we're finding is that, I mean, what matters here is what are the drivers in place for academic institutions to embark on this innovation journey. And I mean, the key thing really from a grounded perspective is if this has been made a strategic priority by the organization, and if it is a strategic priority, then appropriate resources will follow. So there is time for the academics to engage in this. They're freed up from their other day-to-day commitments. There are resources made available in the form of financial resources, incentives, but also, for example, space and any technical support that they might need. There's the opportunity for a genuine interdisciplinary dialogue. So it's the academics coming together with the clinicians, with the patients or the carers, their representatives. But then also increasingly we need others coming from engineering or mathematical backgrounds or software engineering perspectives, and then also business development expertise, because quite often I mean, that is lacking. So a number of drivers need to follow if we're going to become serious about this, I think.
So you build this hospitable environment for innovation, and you get lots and lots of ideas, but the number of resources, even in a very hospitable environment, to take those ideas and actually test them, it's not sufficient to pick up everything. So one of the most important steps in the innovation process is actually the narrowing of the many ideas down to the few that you're going to place your bets on. Can you say something about how successful organizations go about that filtration process?
Yeah, so I mean, if anybody's been to a hackathon or a sandpit event, I mean, these will generate hundreds of ideas. There's no shortage of pain points that we're grappling with. So it is. A big challenge for an organisation is to try and decide which horse to back. And I think the science of this is really just emerging. But I think there are some key determinants here. So one is the idea, and to what extent it is actually grounded in meeting a need. And then an organisation also needs to think about whether the timing is right and whether this represents a commercially viable proposition, if that is one of the intents there. I think another driver is what is the quality of the team. So is there the relevant expertise available in the team, or are they willing to expand that team to bring in appropriate expertise? And I think what we expect from is that many of these ideas will fail, and so we need to give them the opportunity to do rapid prototype testing, test these ideas with the stakeholders, and quite often the stakeholders are those who are going to be implementing or of the ideas to commercialize, those who've got experience there, to see, and get rapid feedback and the opportunity to iterate. And I think then if there is ideas that are being shortlisted, can we actually give them some initial resource and free up some time to actually go on and develop those and take these through to the next stage. So I think a number of things can be useful, but in essence, to my mind, it boils down to the idea, whether it's feasible to actually implement this, and then is there a market base, or is somebody likely to pay for this at the end of the day?
David, in the U.S. at least, there's this proliferation of innovation centers, particularly at academic institutions, and you are based at one. What are the ingredients of a successful innovation center in an academic setting?
Yeah, so one of the key things is just having a focus, and there are generally 3 areas of focus that you can pick from: drugs, devices, or digital. Those are the 3 areas that generate the most revenue, and it's pretty important to pick one of those and then really to make that your main thing. At our own center, we, for example, have focused on the digital area after doing some waffling around early on. And you also have to decide to what extent your goal is to create things that are going to be successful in industry versus things that will have a clinical focus. And there's a lot of variation amongst the good centers in terms of how they elect to do that. We went through some of the top ones in the States, and for example, Cleveland Clinic is very focused on developing commercially successful things. Same is true of University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which has a very good innovation center. Mayo, on the other hand, is sort of more in the middle, and they do some things that are commercial, but they do other things that are more clinical, and they have a very big design focus. Geisinger, on the other hand, is more clinically focused, but they have developed clinical protocols that they try and license. And then University of Pennsylvania is another good one that's really on the clinical end.
In the business literature, there's this whole discussion about disruption and disruptive innovation. Our healthcare sector is large, highly resourced. In many sectors, you expect to see innovation coming from upstart, smaller entities that are trying to nudge their way in, but the scale of investment required for some innovations is such that you can really only do it in the context of a larger setting. So can you talk about the balance between innovation coming from internal investments like the ones you just described within an established center as opposed to outside disruptors?
Sure, and that's a really big question. Can big organizations disrupt themselves? There are very strong incentives in the other direction around that. One of the models that's been the most successful is what University of Pittsburgh has done. And what they do is find little companies that they think are doing something that is interesting, that will make a difference for them, and they then work with them. And they have things set up so that they have model contracts so that there's not a lot of detail to go through in establishing a contract. They are good at establishing co-development relationships, so they use that as a carrot. And they have standard approaches around intellectual property and don't spend a lot of time arguing about that. So just standardizing all those things can be really helpful. And many organizations do not have their ducks in a row around those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I want to use that to try to build a bit of a bridge between the topics in your two papers. And Aziz, you did a little bit of that a moment ago. It's easy, I think, to think of the data sharing as sort of a technical question, and your survey of do the policies cover privacy, autonomy, and the like. But in the context of innovation, these aren't really technical questions, or I should say they're technical questions that have significant implications for the ability to innovate. And so I'm just going to try to get a little bit of a flow between these two topics to bring in a sense of where's the role of innovation in the data sharing and data policies, Effie, that you describe, and what's the role of the innovation movement inside, particularly inside academic medical centers, to pay attention to data sharing, or are these really two separate worlds?
Well, from my perspective, they are actually very connected. If I were to group the challenges around why we're not sharing, I would say that some are technical, as you pointed out, some are regulatory. There are some regulatory issues that do not allow us, maybe in some cases, to share. There are some what I would call attitudinal kind of challenges. So it's the wrong attitude about how to do that. One might being that people don't have their ducks in a row around matters that could be conducive to innovation. So I think these are, and so innovation can come into all three of my kind of categories. Perhaps the technical is self-evident, but even for the regulatory, we could think in more innovative ways. If you take innovation, the meaning being a little bit a bit broader, and I'm not sure how we can innovate on attitude. But my suspicion is that if we innovate, if we have technological rather, and regulatory innovation, that might have an effect on the kind of attitude that organizations have. One thing I'd like to point out, I mentioned it briefly yesterday, so allow me to repeat it, is I don't think when we talk about data sharing, it is so much the problems that individuals may have with their data being sharing. In my experience, the most trouble we have is with organizations not want to share with other organizations, and the innovation will happen in those organizations. So as long as we don't have that relationship organized and developed, I think this would continue blocking innovation in that respect. Not all innovation is about data sharing, I suppose, but there's a big chunk of it, at least in the digital that you mentioned, that it will. So I will see innovation coming in different ways in those three, let's say, categories. Did I build a bridge?
You did. I'm going to add a span to it though
Okay.
before. So what I'm hearing is that there's a policy regulatory innovation that's necessary to achieve the technical innovations that are possible through data analytics and artificial intelligence and the like. And I guess I'm going to ask you, and I'm sure the answer is both, so I'll say the answer before I ask the question, but where does the leadership come from? Do the attitudes change and then people say, oh, we're running into a regulatory barrier, so we need to change the regulation? Or do the regulations change and that enables people to do things that they weren't able to do before? Where does the innovation cycle begin?
Well, that's a kind of a challenging question, because I think there's a parallel development. I mean, we're seeing it, for example, in the you could look at the EU right now with the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a kind of piece of legislation that will affect innovation in way or another, in several ways. It will affect data sharing in several ways, right? So we had there are several attitudes that kind of influenced that sort of legislative movement and legislative history, because that piece of legislation was being under development for several years. One was the technological developments and an increasing feeling that we have, which maybe means attitude, we have to become more protective of our data, and that then trickled the legislatory mechanisms to come up with a piece of legislation. So in this case, I think was a need that led the regulatory movement. Now, if you ask the question, is that regulatory outcome the one that we all wish to have? That is another kind of question. In some ways, yes. In some ways, probably less so. But I think the attitude is the one that probably that generates a response from from legislators. And I think that's probably not the bad way. But some things are also developing, I guess, in parallel. On regulation, that's legislation. On more taking regulation to be a bit more broadly understood, I would say that, again, attitude can help us develop best practice. And best practice is something that I at least feel strongly about, because it can, within the boundaries of the law, it can help institutions start changing also their attitudes through partnerships about data sharing.
Well, that's a perfect way to take the bridge from the other side. So let me ask the question this way. When you think of an innovation center, sort of inwardly focused, do you think of examples? This is a center, an academic center that's trying to innovate, to be competitive in the marketplace, to move forward. That's a competitive posture. The data sharing is a cooperative posture, but you need the sharing in order to maximize the learning from the innovation. So from the perspective of those who are trying to innovate, where does sharing fit? Is it an afterthought? Are the walls up? How are we thinking about it from the side of the innovator?
So, I mean, I think, what would really drive innovation and what would, in terms of data sharing, what would catalyze this are two key developments. One is the funders insisting on this, and increasingly, I'm seeing that they are insisting on this. It's being used as a criteria. And number two, it's easy to pass the buck, but I think, Alan, if the journals actually insisted on the data sets also being published alongside the papers. So if you had it, a pincer type movement, that would really push the boat out in this respect. And this isn't new, because we see this in other fields. So astronomy, they do share data sets. So we're just late to this party, I think.
And I'm going to look at it from a bit of a different angle. Many of the opportunities that come to us as an innovation center involve taking a bunch of our data and then shipping it off someplace else, which may be across a couple of oceans. And when we talk to the data team about that, there's a lot of nervousness about that. The rules are not completely clear. If things are completely de-identified, then it's usually okay. But for many things, you need data that are identified in some way. So we need better rules and policies about doing that. And I think a lot of the benefits will come from that. And another dimension here is the cloud. And healthcare organizations are not necessarily very comfortable having their information in the cloud. Does it have to be a private cloud? Can it be a public cloud? This is just yet another thing that needs to be worked out. But I'll give you an example. I was just working on a study that we've just done. It involved looking at 700,000 of our patients, sending the data over to Israel to a little company that then went through it and looked for signals suggesting that we'd made a medication error. It was quite complicated getting the approval to do that, and but that's the kind of thing that will be coming up all the time nowadays.
So I'm going to ask one more question, but I want you all to get prepared to join in the conversation as well. And if you don't ask, I'll keep going, but I suspect there will be some good questions from the audience. Effie, again, going back to your work, I note that public engagement was fairly low on the policies covered by the sharing. And your comment yesterday that echoed by others on the panel, that from a patient perspective, people are generally willing to share if they think it will be used appropriately. And then you also commented that the GDPR regulations really come out of a sense of an increased need to focus on privacy. So I want to get to the question of data ownership. If I'm a patient at your, David, at your facility, and you want to do some analysis, you have data on me and you want to analyze it, but I'm sharing it with you thinking I'm not giving something to Brigham and Women's, I'm thinking I'm giving something to the greater good of humanity to improve treatment for people who have a condition like mine. So to what extent are we having a serious conversation about who gets to decide who gets to share the data?
Okay, I'll start, and then I'm sure David will have a comment on that too. I think all of us can have some, we will inevitably must have some control over what happens, right? So you cannot just use data that have something to do with me for whatever purpose. In the current kind of activity, though, I think it will be very difficult for me to decide about all sorts of possible uses about my data. And I think that is unrealistic to believe it's happening in a meaningful way, right? In a meaningful way. So the next best thing to that is that I sort of delegate some of this decision making to a trustworthy organization that will make some of those decisions further down the line on my behalf. And that's where the oversight systems come in. Right? We trust an organization like David's, for example, that it won't do the wrong thing with my data, even if he did not ask me for every little detail. That is my hope. And if we can establish that, I think that is the way we can still maintain the ownership in terms of control, but in a meaningful way where something can also can happen. So there is still something we need to work out on the policy side, where we insist on, we still consider consent, because I think that's what you're referring to, as the solution to a lot of problems, and it cannot be. So we need that distribution. If we were to honor ownership, we need to distribute this kind of responsibility between myself, who I have this data to donate or to make available so others are getting a benefit out of that, and to an organization that will act in the best interest also of mine in some way or other. And there, for me, it is feasible to achieve that. I don't think this is a wild dream, and I don't see a conflict between me owning something and others using it for a certain benefit. So broad consent, for example, a broader kind of agreement of people for their data to be used goes into that direction. If you have broad consent, it means that the organization has even a bigger responsibility to make the right decisions about where they're going to send the data. And there, I think that sharing of responsibility honors the ownership and the respect for people.
And if can I just ask, would you encourage some sort of an annual feedback cycle to those who've donated their data to explain how this trustworthy organization has actually used the data?
I absolutely would. I think, and for me, that would be derived from the principle of respect to persons. What we mean often as respect to persons, and it's in every single guideline, is that we get their consent to do something. A part of respecting a person in that relationship that we develop is that we tell them what happens. We tell them what we did with this data. Most of the time, those who donate data, they don't know, because they're not going to read the paper that was published in X journal. They don't hear what happened. So there is no also cycle of understanding how useful their contribution was in one way or another. So absolutely part of that.
I'm sure they wouldn't read it in X Journal, but Health Affairs is a different matter.
Yes, yes. I did not
course.
say that. It's other journals.
Yeah, I think that this is a thorny set of problems, and that we'll need to have ongoing conversations about it, and probably new policies going forward. The ones that we have weren't really didn't really anticipate all the changes that have occurred. I agree with Effie's broad framework. I do see some organizations doing things that I think are ethically questionable, taking large data sets and just selling them to private companies, for example.
Well, we don't need to focus just on data or data transfer. The topic here is the broader one of supporting innovation. We have a microphone, so as it comes to you, please identify yourself and ask a question.
Hi, I'm Michelle Berry from Stanford. I'm Dean of Global Health and I direct a Center of Innovation. I have to humbly say I think this is a somewhat narrow discussion of what an academic institution can do to be a disruptive innovator. And that may be because I'm on the West Coast and in the middle of Silicon Valley. But our students put out about 1,400 patents a year. We have an entire office that's set up to help them with regulations and IP and a whole system. I just want to say that one can work non-competitively. We have a very interesting program called Spark, where we actually bring in the VCs, because I think the problem
So
is
I'm
there's
gonna-
no lack of innovation.
I'm going to do a little interpretation here. IP is intellectual property.
I'm sorry.
VC is venture capital. Just want to make sure we're all together on this.
So I don't think there's any lack of disruptive innovation in the world going on right now. I think the problem, and you can see it here downstairs, the problem is scale up and getting it through the valley of death. And when I say the valley of death, that means once you have a great idea, how do you actually get it out there? And I think what you need to do is engage the private sector. And so what we have is we bring in the venture capitalists to actually help these students. And I think you have to I have to humbly say you have to get out of a medical school, work with your engineers and the rest of your university in multidisciplinary teams. So we will not let one person from a medical school innovate. You have to, when we seed grants, we have an accelerator, you have to work with at least 3 members of a different school. So I think that robust discussion makes for much more interesting innovation and disruptiveness. So I'm sorry,
Well, no,
I come from a different perspective.
So I think part of it is what types of innovation, and I think, David, at the outset, you gave a very brief sort of typology of different areas of focus, and maybe you can react to this comment.
I think your comments are fair in many respects. Stanford's intellectual property policies are especially progressive and very different from those of any other university, and I think that's stood you in good stead. I totally agree with you about involving multiple types of people. All the innovation centers that we've evaluated and that our leaders tend to do that.
In the back here.
Stephen Dorrell. I'm a former health minister in the UK, and I'm a board member of King's Health Partners, which is an academic health science centre in London. And what I wanted to try to do was to tease together the two themes in this discussion, because I had quite a lot of sympathy with the lady from Stanford, that we're talking about data, and we're talking also about the relationship with individual citizens and patients. And then we're wondering how we facilitate innovation, and we're concerned that innovation doesn't spread quickly enough around the health and care sector. I suspect the answer to the second question lies in greater power for the citizen and a more direct relationship between those who make decisions about the shape of health and care services and the citizens they serve. Because the tendency is for us to create structures of trust in order to safeguard citizen data and trust us to shape these systems in your interests, and not, if I may say so, among the policymakers, to trust the individuals to shape the services that meet their own needs more accurately than we, the policymakers, might think that they will. We should recognize the best deciders of what people want for their lives are those individuals themselves.
I think the first thing that we need to do in the U.S. in particular is just change how care is reimbursed, and if we do that, then there'll be robust incentives for organizations to invest in things that make care more efficient. On the trust front, that's complicated. I've done a lot of work on apps recently. We certainly have plenty of apps. There are several 100,000 apps. Most of them are really, no good. They do not deliver much benefit. The market has not worked so well, and we had a paper recently in JAMA in which we talked about changing the framework. Many of the apps that have been developed really do not respect a patient's needs in ways that I think that they should. I do think that there's a role for federal oversight in some areas like that.
Maybe on trust again, but also on your comment that people are the best arbitrators of what is in their best interest. Well, we could discuss that, but I still think the system I was trying to describe of a broader consent of oversight mechanisms that will make some of those decisions for the collective. I think they've been shown, at least in small scale, to increase people's trust in the system. And in fact, if they generate a benefit that can be fed back to those individuals, then it can help them make their own decisions about how they're going about their lives. So if you do produce at the end, through these trust systems, products that enable people to make decisions about their care, I think you reinforce what you were saying about them having, the possibility to do that. So I wouldn't see having oversight mechanisms that try to protect people's interest as being in contradiction with people making decisions about themselves in the context of data. And the opposite, and the contrary, I think we've been seeing that these kinds of systems build people's trust and they help them make decisions. So I would not see that as a conflict.
Yes, here in the front row.
Iman Radwan, Minister of Public Health, Healthcare Quality and Patient Safety Department. Just coming to that panel or policy briefing, I was expecting something around a global policy that helps innovation transfers, so something around intellectual property and how that would be facilitating some sort of a global policy that facilitates transfer of innovation from one place to another, not focusing on intellectual property as a hinderer to that spread. That was I was expecting to hear about. So,
it's a wonderful question, and I don't think we quite teed it up, but I'm happy to see if any of you want to comment on that, or if it's sort of beyond the scope of your.
Maybe. I mean, it's an important question. I don't think I have a great answer to this, but just perhaps some information around this. if we're trying to harmonize, if we're thinking about a global kind of framework and try to harmonize all those kinds of guidelines and approaches, I do think that would be definitely desirable, but we know from experience that it is not an easy thing to do, and in many cases it hasn't been very successful. One current, at least effort towards those lines, along these lines, is the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, an organization that focuses mostly on genomic data, but let's use it as an example. What they're trying to do is to develop some sorts of, some standards and some policy approaches that all partners will agree upon. So it is not global as in the United Nations and countries ratifying that, because we've seen, I mean, that's like the sort of higher level. But it is at the practitioners, let's say, level and institutions level that if they agree that they take a certain approach to intellectual property or to certain standards of governance, that will enable the activity and the cooperation. But that's one example I'm thinking could possibly be used here.
There was someone directly behind.
But maybe
Oh,
So,
sorry.
Alan, can I
Aziz, and-
come back?
Yes.
So, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we've got is that there is a lot of innovation taking place within our health systems and academic health systems. And the trouble at the moment is unless this is being reported in the peer-reviewed literature, quite often this is locked within that system, and there isn't really, an avenue to share those experiences and prevent unnecessary duplication efforts. So I think WISH is beginning that process. I know Weill Cornell, for example, have also been doing this around innovations in global health professional education that's being led here, funded by the Qatar Foundation. So I think these are possibly the vehicles, but what I do know, and particularly I saw this when I was visiting leading US centers, so many of these innovations, for commercial reasons, they're not being shared outside those health systems, and there's incredible wastage, I think, for our global community as a result.
And I'm just going to jump in to say, again, the term innovation is very broad, and there's clinical advances that are based on some of the data science and that you all discussed in more detail yesterday. There's a lot of what we would call delivery system innovation, just improving models of care. Some of them have great commonalities around the globe, but some of them are very specific to either delivery models or financing models in individual settings that are not transferable. And they're also not subject to intellectual property constraints. Learning how to take better care of a population is not really something you can patent the way you can a drug or even an app. So I think one of the risks we have in having a conversation about innovation is to be too general about the term, and that we're going to need different kinds of policies in different dimensions. So Tahir, yes. There you go.
My name is Abir Al-Hamadi. I come from Qatar Foundation. I work in the area of technology transfer, IP, and innovation. And I agree with you with regard to the question. IP is important, but it doesn't cover innovation go more than IP, because you have different type of innovation that cannot be protected through traditional IP laws, as well as to innovate. You can innovate outside of the framework of IP. I have one question to the panel, and I want to embrace over the comment from Stanford, is that the value of death is the struggle we deal with everywhere. But I have a question related to the role of science. For example, being, for example, from Stanford or from London, Stanford have the top, researchers and so on. How does this play a role? And do we see more innovation coming from developed countries versus innovation still being, still within specific centers within Western countries and so on. Thank you.
Comments here?
Sure. I mean, I think we see innovations coming from really from all parts of the world. There's some places that seem to be producing more than others. Israel is one place that's done exceptionally well at generating a lot of innovation, for example, in part because they've supported innovation and created a sector that makes it easy for companies to work on that. There are similar efforts in the Arab world to do some of the same things. Abu Dhabi is working on that. But we see some innovations coming from places that are much less developed. So it really is coming from everywhere.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I agree with David. I think innovation is something that we see happening globally, and so it may be worth looking at Lord Nigel Crisp's work around turning the world upside down to look at some innovations coming from less developed sectors and how those are beginning to scale. I think the other dimension here that's important is that the framework that we have in place is really important. So I mean, the UK has been historically a bit of a laggard in terms of innovations coming from the academic sector, but what has begun to change this is that now the way universities are assessed and financial remuneration to universities is now in part about impact, and this is impact beyond academia. So creating companies contributing to the wealth agenda, etc., are all now being assessed, and as a result, universities across the UK are beginning to grapple with this. So I mean, I think that there are policies that that can be put into place, and certainly, I mean, our experiences in the UK, they definitely do have an impact.
Maybe I just quickly say that I come from the country which is the world's top country on innovation. It was ranked again, and it's been ranked sort of over the last years as #1 innovation hub of the world. And it's interesting to see that in the same country there is an incredible public investment in scientific research. That is, again, a really important thing. So a lot of what's happening is happening in our research institutions, very well resourced institution, but there's a lot of push also from the state to have those partnerships with the private sector. And these two things, I think, play a role in, because Switzerland is it's a wealthy country, but it is a small country compared to other parts of the world.
So we're running out of time, and I think I'd like to just close by asking each of our panelists to respond to a question, which is, we start with the question of policy here, and my question to you would be, looking at the knowledge you have and the work you've done around innovation, what policy recommendation or recommendations would you make to advance the kind of innovation that we've been discussing here? And Effie, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, what we also argued on the paper was that in terms of policy, what we need is more, I'll use the word, innovative ways of looking after these priority themes in policy, privacy and consent and equality. But very importantly, we need to pay attention to those other themes that we have not mobilized. Pay attention to accountability, solidarity, and the sustainability that you also mentioned. I think these two in combination are not very difficult to achieve, and they could give us very quick returns. And the other thing in terms of data sharing, which was the question, and to the extent that that could support innovation, I think what I would pay attention to from the policy perspective is the kind of oversight mechanisms that take a bit of the weight from some of the focus on difficult consent kind of approaches, and have these oversight mechanisms looking more at the purpose of use of data rather than where they come from, what they're tagged with, and all of that stuff. So these directions, at least from the area I have studied, I think they would be useful and they are achievable, and there we could see also some more harmonization at the global level.
And just so I can understand it, that very last clause, where do these policies reside? Who are you speaking to when you say?
So I mean, again, I think you can have those kind of public policy type of thing from our government, but I do think a lot of what's happening, and it's effective, is that the communities of practitioners, institutions can do that, and agreement amongst institutions and professionals, in my view, they go a long way, at least in some of those cases.
Thank you. Aziz.
Yeah, so I mean, the work we do is largely in the digital innovation space, and in that area, I mean, I think the key thing that I'd like to see is improved ways of data sharing. The reasons are, I mean, that what we are now doing is linking all sorts of data assets, so health, but going way beyond health. And now in my group, I have people coming from engineering, computer science, mathematics, informatics backgrounds. And the more eyes that we can allow on these data, I mean, the greater uses that people see. But one of the challenges that we have is at the moment, we do not have an effective mechanism of getting industry to get a look at these data. And I'm sure, I mean, if that were possible, then we'd probably progress on this innovation journey much more rapidly.
And would you agree with Effie that there is a role for public policy, but there's also much of this can be done through collaborative efforts at the industry level?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yes, I mean, broadly, I mean, I think that is right. But for us, getting data sharing with industry is... it's a difficult issue. I mean, so sharing sort of amongst public services, amongst the academic communities, I think something that we're probably going to be able to facilitate much more rapidly. But the industry is a much more tricky issue in a publicly funded system.
David.
Yes, so what I would say is closely related. I'd say policies that enable access, low cost, low friction access to appropriate parties, including industry, to large data sets that include outcomes.
So what I'm hearing is that the foundation of the innovation that we've been discussing really is data and the analysis that's possible from that. And so if we want an innovative environment, we have to address some of the data sharing and data ownership and all of those complex topics. Otherwise, we're just locking ourselves down and limiting our potential around the innovation that's possible. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for the discussion today.